Hello and welcome to the Nexus. Today's show, the Unga Games, the UN General Assembly. They're the Olympics for world leaders and are being held right now in New York. Well, the competitors come from every country on the planet. Your leader's probably there. And as usual, the sparks have been flying. We'll be focusing on President Trump's big speech, which got a big laugh, but may not be the reaction he was looking for. We'll also be asking which country deserves to join the famous five at the UN's top table. Turkey, India, another choice perhaps? All that and more coming up right now here in the Nexus. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore, and today in the Nexus we're playing Unga Games. 193 countries send their top people to the UN in New York and bore us all to death with hours and hours of speeches. I am just kidding, of course. Unga is very important, but it has, undoubtedly, over the years produced some real classic moments.
Welcome to the United Nations General Assembly. We gather here to confront global challenges in a spirit of common cause. Climate change, inequality, hunger, conflict, and extreme poverty affect millions of people every day. Everyone can help to advance peace, prosperity, and human rights, and together, let's build a better world for all. Welcome to the United Nations General Assembly.
We are not gays.
Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe's speech to the UN General Assembly harped on some familiar themes.
Turkish security tried to get in the wrong exit door to go in, and UN security kept them out, and there was a fistfight and a battle with various uniformed UN personnel on the floor.
He went on to declare terrorists losers. He called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man again.
We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has addressed the UN General Assembly, claiming his country is under threat from what he called uncivilized Zionists.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Afterward, the Venezuelan leader, Hugo Chavez, spoke, and he said he detects the smell of sulfur in the air, indicating that he felt the devil and George Bush had been there.
Gaddafi certainly didn't do anything to ingratiate himself in this long, bizarre speech. He tossed a copy of the UN Charter, defended the Taliban and the Somali pirates, and implicated the Israelis in the assassination of JFK. After 1 hour, 35 minutes, and 6 seconds, he finally wrapped it up.
Well, let's turn to our panel of experts now. We're going to start with our regular, Professor Scott Lucas, expert in American studies. Over the years, Scott, Unga has produced some incredible moments. Which was the standout moment for you?
Well, I'm going to reach way back, and that is in 1960, when the then Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who was accusing the U.S. of spying on his country and declaring that Moscow would prevail, emphasized the point by taking his shoe off and repeatedly banging it on the podium. Well, here we are almost 60 years later. That seems quite tame by what we've seen in the past week.
That's true. At least he's not threatening to destroy an entire country. Hannah, for you?
Oh, that's a classic. For me, is not in Unga, but actually in the UN climate change negotiations, we had a Venezuelan negotiator who decided that it was right to actually draw blood from her hand to show just how much that agreement was going to hurt herself and her country.
That's Hannah Ryder there. She used to work at the UN Development Programme in China. She's joining us from Beijing. And another new face on the Nexus is Salman Haider. Salman has been an Indian diplomat for decades, used to be the Foreign Secretary for India, and was also the representative for India to the United Nations between 77 and 80. So, Salman, you've seen it all. What was your favourite moment at the United Nations General Assembly, the most striking thing for you?
It's always fun. It's always something that engages you and sort of draws you into what's happening. And one has to remember also that, you know, as you were saying a little while ago, it does have different dimensions to it. One of them is that of the UN activity, that people don't really know what to expect. There can be unexpected responses from different parts of the floor, and which can be a little fiery on occasion. And what has excited me in the time here is are some of our own leaders. Mr. Vajpayee was one of them. He was an outstanding political leader, and he commanded the assembly and spoke with great eloquence.
Salman, thank you very much for that. Let's go back to Professor Scott Lucas for a moment. Scott, when you watch domestic television here and probably in other places around the world, the UN General Assembly barely merits a mention. What's going on? Why doesn't it get more coverage?
I hope.
Well, in fact, only until recent years have we really paid that much attention to it, because the United Nations, for a lot of people, is this place in New York, and international affairs are far removed from their homes and from their schools. But we paid attention to it in recent years because of the performances, whether it be a Gaddafi, whether it be Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, whether it be Barack Obama, in a much different way than what we expected from Donald Trump. We're going to read a lot this week about the headline performance, probably Donald Trump. But there's two things to watch out for. Remember, first of all, that each national leader is playing back to his audience this week. So when President Erdogan in Turkey had his moment, his 30 minutes, he had messages about Turkey being a key rising power, linking Europe and the Middle East, and indeed going beyond that. And when we look, for example, at, let's say, Emmanuel Macron of France, he's talking about France and Europe being a counterweight to the US. And beyond that, it's the committee meetings that matter. It's the committee meetings where you talk about climate change and development. That's where the hard work is being done, rather than in one headline moment, which brings boos or cheers.
Hannah, I suppose you despair sometimes and wish the UN General Assembly would get more press attention?
To a degree. I think the UN does raise and work on really important issues on development, on climate change, as Scott was mentioning. That said, of course, there's always ways to make it more interesting, you know, cut down those speeches, try and have some more interesting types of
They never stick to the 15-minute rule, do they?
No, but I think that's pretty normal with all sorts of occasions. I usually say the professional tip is really give your speakers word counts rather than minutes. That's always helps.
Hannah, thank you. Well, this year, President Donald Trump didn't threaten to totally destroy another nation as he did last year, but he did make the headlines with this unscripted moment right at the beginning of his address.
In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
They weren't laughing at me. They were laughing with me. We had fun. That was not laughing at me. So, the fake news said people laughed at President Trump. They didn't laugh at me. People had a good time with me.
Well, let's go back to his biggest fan now, Professor Scott Lucas. Hey, people are having a good time with him. Scott, what's the matter?
Look, mate, they were laughing at you, okay? I mean, it was a laughter which was kind of almost a shock, because almost everybody knows Trump is going to be like the showman. He's going to be almost oblivious to reality. But they were even shocked by how far he went, the most miraculous U.S. president in history. But I think the wider point of that moment is interesting. I think most delegations in that room realize they're no longer dealing with Trump, at least in the sense of getting anything done. So it was almost as, all right, give him his half hour, and then they've got to make connections back with U.S. officials. And that's what I said. It's what's happening behind the podium. And when the Donald goes back to Washington, that's what you got to keep your eyes out for.
You see, the thing is, Scott, I mean, you think obviously he's an ineffectual leader who's just looking for applause and so on. But at least from his point of view, he's got quite a record to defend. Here's some of the substance of what President Trump had to say, particularly his record on North Korea and on Iran.
You have the floor, sir.
In June, I traveled to Singapore to meet face-to-face with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un. I would like to thank Chairman Kim for his courage and for the steps he has taken, though much work remains to be done. The ongoing tragedy in Syria is heartbreaking, but rest assured the United States will respond if chemical weapons are deployed by the Assad regime. Iran's leaders sow chaos, death, and destruction. We cannot allow a regime that chants death to America and that threatens Israel with annihilation to possess the means to deliver a nuclear warhead. Just can't do it.
Dramatic stuff. Professor Lucas, North Korea, it's going really well, isn't it?
Well, he got his photo opportunity with Kim Jong-un. But in fact, the negotiation...
And what about the destruction of missile launching areas and missiles? And they didn't bring out their usual ballistics at the big parade? These are not good indicators?
Oh, the North Koreans are flattering Trump's ego, but U.S. intelligence services summarized just a few weeks ago that North Korea has not halted its missile and nuclear program. In fact, they've actually escalated it since June.
Well, the weird thing is, I mean, we know that Trump's embraced the North Korean regime, but is doubling down on Iran. Iran, of course, ever eloquent, the President Rouhani. Here's his comeback.
It is ironic that the US government does not even conceal its plan for overthrowing the same government it invites to talks. Unlawful unilateral sanctions in themselves constitute a form of economic terrorism and a breach of the right to development. The economic war that the United States has initiated under the rubric of new sanctions not only targets the Iranian people, but also entails harmful repercussions for the people of other countries.
Salman, who has the greater credibility with the UN audience, President Rouhani or President Trump?
President Trump is the most potent among the world's leaders today. I know that all kinds of things are said about President Trump, and there's a great chorus on the subject. But whatever one may hear, the significance and the weight and moment of this individual is there for everyone to see. And
has the reimposition of US sanctions on Iran changed India's outlook and relationship with Iran?
India has had a long-standing and a very valuable connection with Iran, which is to do with oil, not only with oil, it has to do with its historic ties that go back now centuries. You know, these are not matters that can be ignored.
Well, as we all know, Trump recently imposed sanctions on Turkey too, trying to pressure the NATO ally into releasing an American pastor who they're detaining on terrorism charges. So naturally, relations are a little tense. But with the two men speaking one after the other at the UN, they did bump into each other. And by the looks of these photographs, they did at least manage to be civil. But President Erdogan still had a few strong words to say during his address.
Those who equip terrorists with tens of thousands of trucks and cargo planes and many weapons will regret it in the future. Supporting terror groups while still keeping the doors closed to immigrants doesn't make anyone's future safer or brighter.
Well, a few clues there as to who he was talking about. But Scott, if you could just confirm for us, who was in his sights when he said that?
Well, he's looking at Donald Trump and the Americans, because Turkey's playing a game, diplomatic hardball right now with the United States. They're doing it, for example, over issues in the Middle East, such as the Syria crisis. but they're also doing it over internal factors. The United States has been quite critical of Turkey's approach to journalists, imprisoning them, and it's been quite critical, of course, of the detention of individual Americans. But everyone's also playing a broader game here, and that is he's trying to present himself as a leader who is on the same level, well, as a Trump, or even beyond him, or on the same level as a Vladimir Putin in Russia. So in other words, there's two games that go on here. One is international, but the second is back home to your people, trying to cut a figure of authority.
Now, let's get to Hannah's expertise now, China. Trump's address to Unga was on Tuesday. The following day, he chaired the UN Security Council. That's the UN's top decision-making body. Well, Trump gets to chair it because the US currently holds a rotating presidency. He opened the session with a bang of the gavel and quickly moved on to accuse China of trying to rig the upcoming US elections.
Regrettably, we found that China has been attempting to interfere in our upcoming 2018 election, coming up in November, against my administration. They do not want me or us to win because I am the first president ever to challenge China on trade. And we are winning on trade. We are winning at every level.
Let's go to Beijing and Hannah. Hannah, did you see the look on the Chinese foreign minister's face when he said that?
Absolutely, a little bit of surprise there. Something coming really from nowhere, to be honest. So, although obviously, as we know, US and China are not on great terms, there is a trade war, or what China will call trade friction. So Trump even referred to that quite a lot in his major speech as well.
Of course, both China and the United States have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. How do you think China's going to use its leverage at the UN?
Well, I think China's, going to try and do another Davos moment. If you remember, some year or so ago, President Xi was at Davos and made a very big kind of, we are a great globalization leader. We promote as much free trade and so on as possible. And I think that will be the tactic that China takes here as well, really trying to say, we are not a foreign power that is looking to be isolationist like the US. We are going to be much more open. And you know, you can see that even with the recent visit of African leaders to China here in a few weeks ago. China's really trying to play, we're going to be an open country as much as possible. Whether it's true or not, that's another question.
Thank you, Hannah. Okay, so that little exchange there with Donald Trump was at the UN Security Council. We've talked about that. We've talked about the UN General Assembly. Now, clearly, the UN Security Council is far more powerful, which begs the question, what's the point of Unga then?
Oh, please. The UN spends on average $100 million a year promoting itself with ads like this, trying to catch our attention. But is Unga really worth keeping an eye on? Does anything get done? Well, every leader gets their 15 minutes of fame. Some of them take a little more, of course, and it gives everyone a chance to air their grievances on the world stage.
This is a bomb. This is a fuse. In the case of Iran's nuclear plans to build a bomb, this bomb has to be filled.
The first ever UN General Assembly was held in London in a Methodist church in 1946, 1 year after World War II came to an end. Traditionally, ever since 1947, Brazil always goes first. Then comes the host nation, the United States, and then the rest is a bit up for grabs and depends on a range of criteria, including whether or not your head of state attends. It's supposed to be a model of democracy, with every country getting one vote.
So you get the same say whether you're giant China or tiny Nauru, one of the smallest of the 193 member states with a population of just 10,000. But the voting can be a bit meaningless. The only thing they really control is their own budget, which, by the way, has swollen to $5.4 billion. And the rest of the time, resolutions are non-binding. And anyway, the really important decisions must go through the UN Security Council, which has the power to overrule even the General Assembly. This exclusive body has just 15 members. 10 of them are voted in by the General Assembly on a rotating basis, but the other 5 form an even more exclusive club. America, Britain, France, China and Russia took their permanent seats as they created and shaped the UN in the aftermath of the Second World War. And even today, they kind of run the show, with each permanent member having the power to veto a resolution. Other countries are becoming increasingly fed up with the status quo and are arguing that other nations should also get a chance to sit as permanent members of the Security Council.
Dünya 5'ten büyüktür.
Well, that was Turkey's President Erdogan back in 2014. He made a similar point this time round too.
The world is not the world of the times of the Second World War, neither the aftermath. We have representatives from 194 countries under this roof. And why 194 countries cannot be represented at the Security Council? Why shouldn't they, in a rotational manner, have their permanent seats at the Security Council? We have only 5 permanent seat holders at the Security Council, and the remainders are just temporary, with no power whatsoever.
Hannah, would you like to see the United Nations reformed to make it fairer for everyone?
Look, this debate has been going on for about 20 years. Why not have everybody rotate? Why should there be permanent members of the Security Council? We're all talking about everyone's talking about new permanent members, India, Turkey, etc. No, let's make the 5 permanent members non-permanent and have them rotate with them.
So you end up with 15 members of the UN Security Council. None of them have a veto, and none of them are permanent.
No, they can all have a veto.
Right.
There's no problem with the veto, but they don't have to be permanent. So they, try in the same way that the 10 non-permanent members at the moment rotate every 2 years, so you could have them on for 4 years or something. They try and.
The thing is, though, Hannah, you could have a scenario where China, Russia, the United States are rotated out, and you have tiny countries like Togo, Sweden, and New Zealand. You'd be happy for them to make decisions on behalf of the world?
Well, it is a scenario which they do have at the moment. There's no reason why, just because you're small, you shouldn't.
Yeah, but they don't have a veto, do they? I mean, you're saying they'd all have a veto. They'd all have an equal say.
Yes. But also let's look at the background. Countries that really do care about being on the Security Council do get there. Japan and Brazil, for example, they've been on there 11. Japan's been on there 11 times. Brazil's been on there 10 times over the last 45 years. So there's no reason why the countries who really want to be there, really want to make a mark, can't be there.
Theoretically, though, you could have China rotated out and Luxembourg is in.
Why not?
Let's go to India. Certainly, if you want a huge country on the UN Security Council with a permanent seat, Salman, a lot of people would argue that India has that right.
I think it certainly does have that a right to aspire to that place of the UN Security Council, and it has been aspiring in that direction for quite some time now, with some effect. And I think that our efforts will continue, and let us expect that there will be positive outcomes.
Hannah, just come back to your proposal where every member state gets a chance to be on the UN Security Council. We have some enormous slow-motion disasters going on right now: Syria, Yemen, Myanmar. Do you think it would have changed the outcome for them if your system had been in place?
Well, I think if you had smaller member states who were part of the Security Council, they can give a different point of view and they can come up with different innovative solutions. Take Syria. You know, Jordan is very important to that discussion. Having Jordan on the Security Council could lead to some other type of outcome, which may be more different to what powers like Russia might think.
Hannah, you get the last word there in Beijing. Thanks to all our guests, including Salman and Professor Scott Lucas. One last treat for you all before we leave you. A song by a couple of Turkish artists who have a rather passionate interest in UN reform.